I am going to be talking about Omoo, which is the second volume in this Library of America volume containing Melville's first three novels. Omoo was published in 1847, pretty much right after Melville wrote and published Tahiti, a very successful novel, a novel that got his name out there. And during his lifetime, and really until the 20th century, it was with Tahiti that was really the foundation of Melville's career and his reputation. His other works weren't nearly as well received, and often they were forgotten for decades. Omoo was also fairly popular. It really matches the style and the approach, and in some ways some of the themes that we see in Tahiti. It's a very different tale in the way it's structured and the things that happen to the character, and the setting is quite different, but it's the same kind of feel. It's presented as autobiographical. It's based on real events that Melville went through. In fact, so Tahiti, as I talked about in the other video and in my podcast on Tahiti, came out of Melville's experiences in the South Pacific, particularly in the Marquesas, when he deserted a ship and lived with indigenous people for a while, and then he got on board another whaling ship. Now, Omoo kind of roughly covers the period of time he spent with that other whaling ship and the experiences he had after that, mostly in Tahiti. So it's a much more, colonized part of the South Pacific. The Marquesas was sort of the frontier, and the people he encountered had some contact with the French and whalers and others, but not that much. The people of Tahiti were much more incorporated into the world system by this point. So it's much more institutionalized. You have councils, you have judges, there are prisons. There is a much more dominant white presence, Anglo-American presence in Tahiti. So it's a very different feel than what we get in Taipei. Anyway, so a lot of the events described in Omoo happened to Melville in one way or another. So he really does work on a potato farm for a while. He really does try to get work in the South Pacific. He really is part of a mutiny. And he really is put in kind of a Tahitian prison for a while. And he escapes from there. And all of these events that happen to the character happen to Melville to some degree. Now, how much he embellished, how much he added to these stories for fictionalizing them, it's not really clear. But you can read it as an autobiography of Melville's own life, or you can read it purely as fiction. It works both ways, but it's thematically very true to life, it seems to me. So if you want to come at this as a historian to kind of get an idea of what life was like in Tahiti for Western sailors at the time, I think you can do that. So the overall story arc of Omoo, we begin the first, about the quarter of the novel is set on board the Julia, which is the ship, and this corresponds to a ship called the Lucienne, which Melville served on after he was picked up in the Marquesas. It's an Australian whaler. And he serves there for a while, and conditions are horrible and miserable and getting worse and worse. And the captain is not really responsive to the crew's needs. And there's a real tension over, do we go out to keep trying to find whales? Because that's what capital demands. That's what the profit motive of these journeys demand. Or do we go back to Tahiti? And so there's this conflict. And eventually there's a mutiny on board the ship, or an attempted mutiny. And this brings the ship back to port, where the sailors are then put under investigation for their role in mutiny. They're ordered to go back out to sea, and when they refuse to do that, they are then put in prison. So the opening, that's about the first third or a half of the novel. So it's really poor conditions on the ship lead to resistance, lead to working class solidarity in the form of resistance. In fact, we have this symbolized in a thing called like the Round Robin, which is actually a petition of sorts signed by all the members of the crew. And there are characters who goes by the name of Taipei, by the way, because that's where he was picked up. So everyone calls him Taipei. We really don't get his true name. The same way he was called Tomu in Taipei, the same character is now being called Taipei by the sailors on board the ship. After they get in trouble with the local council, they are put in prison, which is kind of a French-run prison in Tahiti, but its day-to-day operations are done by the local Tahitians. It's a very loose prison. It's very relaxed. People come and go. I think there's Irish priests who come in and they bring liquor. for the sailors living there. It's pretty loose, and eventually they do just kind of walk out and leave. And then they begin a process that really covers the whole second half of the novel, which is kind of a process of wandering across Tahiti. They go to a few different islands in the area. They're really looking for work, and they work on a potato farm. They run into other kind of European castaways or Euro-American castaways who have kind of started making a life for themselves in Tahiti. One group of people, actually, they were recruited from the prison, I think, to work on this potato farm. For a while, again, this is something that really happened to Melville at the time. And they keep looking for other jobs, and eventually they go to the court of a kind of a local chief, actually as a queen, of the local people, and they are sort of offered a job, and they refuse it at the end. So it's really, the story kind of comes full circle in the end. So it begins with acts of work resistance and mutiny against the ship captain, but it ends with the character with actually a failed job interview. And again, this quest for work fails, and that's kind of a theme throughout the whole novel, is this searching for work and this searching for a place in this world that's very liquid and moving and changing and dynamic. And I think this is one of the really fascinating things about this, is this kind of coming and going of labor for him. That he works at times, but sometimes he resists work, and the character is never really stable and never knows where he wants to be, and he always is looking for the next best thing. And this way he really speaks to us in this Uber economy. I know, like, the economic situations of the millennial generation, where 0-hour contracts are prominent, where people, they're unpaid internships and all these other problems that young workers are facing in the economy, where there's not that kind of the long-term company loyalty that the older generations grew up with. That really, I think the experiences of Tahiti in this novel can really speak to people who are kind of in this Uber economy, where there's no security and no safety, and everything is kind of liquid, and they've lost this stability, like the mortgage, the car, and all the things that used to stick people to one place and one firm and one family has fallen away, and we end up with this very chaotic situation. That existed in this frontier of Pacific capitalism in Tahiti and in the middle of the 19th century. And I've never seen a book, there probably have been books like this, but I've never come across one, I never read one, where a book that ends with a failed job interview. It's something very unique. So if you've ever been frustrated in the job market, this is a book that maybe can give a little bit of catharsis to you. Anyways, I just think it's very unique that a book ends that way. The characters in this story are, in a sense, there's not a single character that stands out. We have two major characters who are Long Ghost, who's a doctor, and he was a doctor on the ship, and then he kind of hangs out with Taipei throughout most of the novel, and he, by the end of the novel, when they're wandering around, is sort of his constant companion. And he's the one who kind of is there with him at the end. And strangely, he doesn't really carry on to the third novel of this sort of trilogy, Marty. Marty kind of goes wild with some of these themes. In a way, it's set up as sort of a sequel to this novel. But Dr. Long Ghost is not there. But he's a fairly memorable character. And then we have Taipei himself, the narrator, who's here throughout the whole story. And beyond that, we have this wide cast of characters, dozens, literally, many of whom are very memorable. We have a lot of Anglo-American castaways and wanderers and migrants and people who've just ended up in the Pacific and ended up, for whatever reason, living there. Some people in service to chiefs, some people who got a bit of land. There's one person who's described who sort of conquered a whole island for himself. Many of these runaway sailors have kind of integrated themselves into Tahitian society in various ways. We have examples of cross-cultural marriages and couplings. It's a pretty exciting, dynamic environment, and this gives Melville a lot of space to establish this broad cast of characters. Now, a lot of them are only there temporarily, but a few that stand out are these like Irish priests who always have brandy with them. It's a French colony, so it's brandy, and that's the drink of the region. We have these two Americans who run this potato plantation there, and they're sort of runaway sailors who established land for themselves and were looking for people to work for them, and they went to the prison to get these workers. And those are some of them, but there's a whole bunch of other characters who come and go in the story. The ship itself has a very international crew, so it's a really wonderful international cast of characters. And of course, if you read Melville's other works like Moby Dick, you know he does that. So especially in Moby Dick, where you have the harpoonists from different cultures, right? There's an Arab, there's an African, there's a Native American, and a Pacific Islander. Those are the harpoonists, and they all kind of represent different parts of this international working class. Here he starts playing with that in the crew of the Julia, and then also just the people floating around the Tahiti. And I think that might be another way this novel can really speak to people today, is in how it has this very liquid population and this very diverse set of characters floating around, the floating population, the almost economic refugees in a lot of ways, and people who are able to establish new lives for themselves in Tahiti, whatever they were running away from or whatever they were fleeing. They're there. So although it's set up as a sequel to Taipei, it has some similar themes, like you have the same anti-imperial criticism, you have the same kind of respect for the indigenous cultures there and this desire to protect them, and a criticism of the missionaries is certainly here as well. But Tahiti is presented as kind of already fallen, as already incorporated into the world system. So with Taipei, you have an area that's still somewhat culturally protected, an enclave of indigenous culture before empire has come. In Omoo, you see the place where empire has come, and what has it brought? It's brought a lot of crap, to be honest. It's brought prisons, it's brought disease, it's brought capitalism, it's brought consumerism and alcohol, and a lot of pretty nasty elements are introduced with empire. But on the other side, you get this very much more wide cast of characters and a lot more diverse experiences, and so it's a little bit more playful, and it's in many ways a more fun novel than Taipei in my view. And I especially like the theme of work resistance and the frustration of the job market and the liquid population. It's just so contemporary for me. So the themes, one of the most important themes to talk about with this novel is empire itself, and as I just said, it's a much deeper penetration of empire here in Tahiti than in the Marquesas, which was much more frontier. You had French ships there, you had missionaries there, and like Nukuhiva was more colonized, but you had the Harpar and the Taipei back in the kind of out in the woods. Those tribes were relatively undisturbed. Here you have a place fully colonized. The French presence is everywhere. You have legal institutions. You have ships coming and going constantly. You have Tahitians working for the French Empire. You have Christianization taking place pretty actively. You have economic domination by the French and the Anglo-European arrivals. So it's a much deeper look of empire, and it's in many ways what the Pacific at large would become as European empires expanded. A second theme, of course, is work resistance, and that dominates the first half of the novel, where you have the entire crew refusing to work. And this becomes the main initial conflict of the novel, and what sets up the rest of the story is an act of work resistance. Very much like Taipei in this sense, but in Taipei it was an individual sailor running away. In Omoo, it's a whole group of sailors resisting, and some resist in different ways. There's one character who actually tries to destroy the ship at one point rather than go out to sea. So work resistance becomes very important, and then this becomes an ongoing theme as our character flees one location to another, always having this dissatisfaction with where he is. And finally, at the end of the day, he can't get a job, and then what can he do but go off to sea again and wander. And one thing that gives these first three of Melville's novels such kind of a richness and a lot of fun is this: each novel ends with kind of you're going off to sea again, and it's really kind of a nice structure for me. Kind of beautiful in a way, and so, again, something that really speaks to, I think, this much more liquid world we live in today. Another theme tied to work resistance is the authority on the ship. Especially we're given the captain, a man named Germain, who's not really effective, who spends much of the time sick, and authority is passed on to like the second mate, who's a very cruel man. So the whole authority on the ship is presented as very brutal and nasty and arbitrary. And there's really no space for workplace democracy here on the ship. And that's why you need the full-blown resistance of the crew. You can see here Melville actually recreates the round robin. And you see the center, all hands, and then all the name of the crew all around it. And if you look closely, you'll see it's a very international group of people. Some people with just X's because they can't sign their name. They're illiterate. A nice little piece of detail. I think, yeah, about half of them sign with X's. More than half, even. I seem to sign with X's. Another kind of carrying over from the authority on the ship is you get the authority on the land. And something you didn't have in Taipei is you just had the ships. And you really didn't have the established authority yet on the land. In this novel, you have institutions of power. You have councils, you have judges, courts, and eventually a prison. So the means of controlling this diverse cast of characters is there. Now, how effective it is something that certainly can be debated. The prison is not particularly effective. People come and go. People are drafted for work out of there. Women come in. There's, various characters that just come and go from the prison. And the authority on the prison is not really that secure. Alcohol is a major theme in this novel. Not something that was very apparent in Taipei, but here again, because we're in a much more colonized place, a place where a consumer economy exists to a certain degree. And the drink of choice in this novel is brandy. And I think that's the French influence. To a small degree, we have a theme of homosexuality discussed here, and I know a lot has been written or theorized about Melville's own sexuality. He was married, but there are, people who have talked about that maybe he was closeted, and certainly his last novel, Billy Budd, has a lot of these themes in it, and they've been talked to death. But in Omoo, you have hints of homoeroticism between various characters. There's one character in particular named Kooloo, Kooloo, who he talks about his affection for. He often talks about his physical appearance in dramatic ways. I'll just quote quickly. Among others, Kooloo was a candidate for my friendship, and being a comely youth, quite a buck in his way, I accepted his overtures. By this, I escaped the importunities of the rest, for be it known that, though a little inclined to jealousy in love matters, the Tahitian will hear no rivals in his friendship. And then later on, this Kooloo seems to find a new boyfriend of sorts that he hangs out with. And so as for Kooloo, after sponging me as well, he one morning played the part of a retrograde lover, informing me that his affections had undergone a change. He had fallen in love at first sight with a smart sailor who was just stepped ashore, quite fresh from a lucky whaling cruise. It was a touching interview, and with it, our connection dissolved. So it's just a little hint. It basically is about just a one page of the text. But it's there, and there's a few other moments in the novel where you get this suggestion of homoeroticism at play. It's even briefly talked about in Taipei in the sense, it's just referenced. And there's this passage where Melville talks about a ship that disappeared, a whaling ship that disappeared, and the rumors are that it's at Buggery Island. But other than that, it's not a big part of Taipei, although he does talk about the Marquesan male body as very attractive from time to time, although he doesn't like tattoos for whatever reason. But besides that, he seems to present them as a physically appealing way. So that's there. There's a critique of the missionary, again, very much like in Taipei. We have Melville sticking it to the missionaries, thinking that the missionaries bring as much sin as they try to eradicate. And their efforts to Christianize bring disaster and chaos to these societies. And so it's not a good presence. Crime is talked about a lot. In fact, the entire crew is involved in a criminal act from the very beginning by resisting work and refusing to obey the command of their shipmaster, their captain. That's a criminal act. And then later on, when they're in jail, they actually break out for a night and steal supplies from a ship because they weren't getting enough food. So they actually work with local Tahitian smugglers and who would break onto ships and steal cargo and things. And they participate in that. And there are other examples of these characters being outright criminal in their behavior. And of course, much of the novel is spent in a prison in Tahiti. We got a lot here about this kind of white vanguard, or white, not vanguard, but the white vagabond class in the Pacific. These are these castaways, runaways, people who just sort of settled in Tahiti. Mostly they came from ships and they refused to work in some degree. So the very act that brings Taipei, our narrator, to Tahiti is what brought this whole cast of characters to them. And they're a very diverse, very exciting, very interesting group of people. And again, you can just read this just for these people. And that's what makes this novel stand out largely. But it's very interesting to me that there was a vagabond class floating around the Pacific. And I've done a little bit of research myself into the Pacific. And I've been reading these like news reports of the early discovery of some of the Pacific Islands, and especially by American ships. And they would sometimes talk about how we just found this island that we just discovered, and there were like white people living on there, or they had families, or they kind of had farms and things. So there was this sort of diaspora in the Pacific, and they did all sorts of things. They're in a sense bringers of empire. And they become part of the claims that America's going to make claims on these islands. But in a way, they're also work resistors and people who are trying to find a new life for themselves. And they were discussed with some element of the capitalist Pacific as represented on the ship and the whaling ship and the merchant ships that dominated so much of the economy in the South Pacific at the time. So what to make of this class, I think, is something each reader is going to have to think for themselves. But they're certainly an interesting group of folk. And then a final thing I want to talk about, because before I close, is ecology. It's something Melville begins to talk about. He actually did a little bit of it in Taipei as well, where he talked about like the arrival of venereal diseases and the arrival of goats and other elements to Hawaii. Here he talks about wild cattle and how the cattle that the Europeans brought spread in some of these islands and started to push out other species. And I'll read a bit of it for you because Melville says it best. Some 50 years ago, Vancouver left several bullocks, sheep, and goats at various places in the Society Islands. He instructed the natives to look after the animals carefully and by no means to slaughter any until a considerable stock had accumulated. The sheep must have died off, for I never saw a solitary fleece in any part of Polynesia. The pair left were an ill-assorted couple, perhaps separated in disgust and died without issue. As for the goats, occasionally you'll come across a black, misanthropic ram nibbling at a scant herbage of some height inaccessible to man, in preference to the sweet grasses of the valley below. The goats are not very numerous. The bullocks, coming from a prolific ancestry, are a hardy set, racing all over the island of Omoo in considerable numbers, though in Tahiti but few of them are seen. As the former place, the original pair must have scampered off into the interior, since it is now so thickly populated by their wild progeny. The herds are the private property of Queen Pomore, from whom the planters have occasional permissions to shoot for their own use, as many as they are pleased. What we have here is a story of an invasive species. And this is, of course, broadly something that can be studied across the Pacific. It happened everywhere. And, of course, it happened in the Atlantic with the Columbian Exchange. Invasive species of all sorts. And even like the bringing of potatoes to here, that's an imported crop. And there's other examples of the introduction of new crops and how that brings a new economic foundation and disrupts the local ecology. He wasn't really aware of, I guess, ecological thinking, but he was aware that the arrival of the Europeans has changed things significantly. And one way they changed things was by the introducing of these new species. So if you want to read this with an ecological eye, there are little tidbits here and there that can be fruitful for you. So that's my overall review of Omoo, the second novel by Herman Melville, the sequel to Taipei. It's just a lot of fun. I think the best part of this novel is the whole narrative of work resistance and the important role of this vagabond class in the Pacific. And you get this wide cast of characters. No one is particularly memorable. It's not the kind of book you're going to think back on in a year and remember every single person you met. But you're going to remember the motley crew of frontier Pacific capitalism and empire. So that does it for Omoo. If you want to know more of my thoughts on it, you can listen to my podcast. I have 3 episodes, and I'll put the links below where I say a little bit more about Omoo. But otherwise, that's it. I'll be back next by looking at the 3rd volume in this trilogy, Mardi. and that one is a doozy. So it's much longer. It's twice as long as both Taipei and Omoo, and it's really weird. So I will try to make a case for why we should revisit Mardi if you're brave enough to do it. But most people see it as failure, but I think there's a lot there to like. So thank you so much for listening, and if you like this, please leave your comments and subscribe, and I'll keep adding content to this, looking at American writers, especially books published in the Library of America. So that's my goal, is to go through the Library of America book by book, giving you my feelings on it. So again, thanks for listening.